In our series of pre-election interviews, we turn to the race for City Council in District 7, the seat being vacated by Acting Mayor Kim Janey. The district covers most of Roxbury, along with parts of the Fenway and the South End. Our guest is one of the candidates with experience working for city departments, ABCD, and the Multicultural AIDS Coalition. We'd like to welcome Angie Camacho.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you very much for joining us, Angie. Angie, we're at a moment and I guess a place in Boston politics where I think people want things to be shaken up, but they want somebody who knows the landscape and knows their way around. So between those two, how would you describe yourself?
I would describe myself as the perfect fit for both of those issues, right? I have been known to shake things up when needed, leading everything from innovative programs to even oh gosh, goodness, thousands of people together on protests when needed. So I'd like to say that I'm a peacemaker with a pitchfork, and that is, that's really what's needed. We need someone who knows how the bread is made because they've been part of the system for long enough to have the institutional knowledge on what's been done, what's worked, what hasn't worked, but isn't afraid to, try new things as well as holding on to some of the legacy things that have started a lot of the progressive issues that we're still fighting for today.
Well, this district, and we're talking mostly about Roxbury here, there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of new development coming in and a lot of apprehension about gentrification, institutional expansion. How do you solve that?
I think relationships are what matters, right? When we're talking about the gentrification that's happening in the area, a lot of the stakeholders are actually fighting a 30-year fight, not a 2, 5, or 10-year fight. And it takes someone who has been part of the work to understand how we got to this place in order to try to stem the tide a bit, if you will. The challenge with Roxbury, which is the main part of our district, is that there's still a lot of great need, but also a need for pushing the opportunity that exists so that we can find a better balance. And it's a hard conversation to have because what most people hear is, we're just going to continue to push people out. And the very real reality is that people have been pushed out and we need to do what we can to stop it, but it requires some balance. It requires understanding some of the compulsory investments that should be made in our district and working on those who should be giving them to make them. When we're talking about pilot, when we're talking about what IDP should look like, when we're looking at alternatives to just a straight rent control. I think we can be more creative than just imposing a rent cap or freezing rents at rates that are unaffordable right now. There's some great work that's happening. Representative China Tyler was inspired by a number of us who have informed her about the affordability calculations now, and she put forward legislation in the State House to try to get more affordable calculations so that local pay is what's driving our affordability rates. And that's the kind of work we need to be doing. And we can't be afraid of development because development pays into the property tax base that helps to pay for some of the things we say are wrong in our schools, that we say are missing in our public programming. Property taxes do pay for that. So we do have to make a way for a reasonable amount of growth while trying to protect the folks who are here. Our legacy residents have a right to remain, but we also must embrace the Roxbury that is coming, that's actually already at our doors, to try to make sure that there's room for everyone.
With housing, there are people in crisis right now, partly because of the pandemic, but there's also concern about this erosion of the middle in Roxbury. The people who would buy their own home and get involved in the neighborhood association and build wealth. And there's a huge wealth gap here, racial wealth gap. What should be done about that?
We just have to keep pressing, right? We have to make sure that one of the things that we don't recognize is there are two groups that are actually stuck: our middle class and our elders who are trying to age in place, right? And a lot of that has to do with financial empowerment and financial literacy, but also financial resource supports, because unfortunately, a lot of what's available in financial servicing in our area is not financial advice or financial management support, but unfortunately a lot of scams. And we have to make sure that someone like me who's been involved in the Too Nice Think Twice campaign for our elders and helped with ABCD to break one of the major senior tax scams that was impacting our seniors, knows how to make sure we're ushering our middle income families towards resources and income supports that helps them, but also our elders who are trying to age in place. How do we make sure that there's structural support for them as well? The one thing we cannot do is we cannot continue to look at this Federal Reserve report and be stuck at this $8. We need to talk about what does it mean for the city to be a model in regards to diverse contracting. We need to talk about how do we make sure that the Boston Jobs Residency policy is actually in place, alive and well, and has the teeth in compliance to actually work for local workers. And anyone who could be hiring our incumbent workers are doing so through pre-workforce development programming to make sure that if someone doesn't have the skills but lives in Boston, can develop the skills in these new areas of workforce or even the new technical specifications of the current workforce to be able to afford whatever they happen to have now.
You have a lot of experience working on solutions. And one example that I think might be interesting to have you talk about is a program called Youth Builders. What did you learn from that?
I learned that it's not enough to just give families one type of resource. And thank you for that. I happen to love Youth Builders. I was just visiting the site to make sure they were alive and well this summer, and they surely were. But what happened with Youth Builders was at the time, and this actually ties into affordable housing. HUD was taking affordable units off of their portfolio. And the challenge is that they were doing so by allowing the residents to create their own self-managing organizations who could either buy the property for $1 or partner with a nonprofit or for-profit, and the sales rate would be based on the type of partnership, or go for what's called syndication. And the challenge with that is it goes back to what I always talk about affordability. Parents have to be able to go to work in order to afford whatever the rent might be. And so while this program was going on, we realized that the families didn't have an option for their children. And so we developed the Youth Builders program to not only provide out of school time care for the kids, but to also allow the parents to have a safe place for their kids to be so that they could work. And so we wrote it into the self-sufficiency and the security plan. And by doing that and being creative about that process, we were the only funded youth program in demonstration disposition, not because HUD actually paid for youth programs, they didn't, but because we were able to look beyond and see the extended need of families beyond just this opportunity for them to maintain housing.
What about the schools right now? You went to an exam school in Boston, but still, when I look at the other high schools in the city, there seems to be almost like a stagnation. They're not really closing in on the achievement gap. What needs to be done?
We need to invest in the business community and push on them to invest in us, right? One of the things that we are already doing is making sure that, at least with my connections, we've been making sure that whenever there's a gap, we press on the power of our local stakeholders to be involved. For instance, just a few years ago, when all of these Peppa robots came into town to try to get kids into AI and coding, the challenge was we had all these robots sitting in buildings unused because nobody knew how to teach the kids to code. Well, at least they didn't have enough people ready to teach them. So Eva Mitchell and I, we talked to Mass Robotics, we talked to a number of other folks, and we worked with BPS in order to make sure that we got volunteers who could teach the kids to code. And we ran, we actually helped them run their February vacation program, and there were about 40 kids who started learning to work with these Peppa robots simply because we got businesses to understand that we are already taking our youth and trying to get them ready to be the next workforce. We need to make sure it's a collaborative effort.
Speaking of gaps, what's really pressing right now is we have a vaccination gap, then it's a racial gap. Plus, we have higher positivity rates in areas such as Roxbury. I think it's already at 5% now. What should be done?
There's a lot that we should be doing about vaccine hesitancy, right? One of the things that we should be doing is pressing upon the different stakeholders who are trying to go and do outreach to give the community the information that they need. But we also need to be very careful in identifying how those numbers shape out, right? One of the things that we need to do is make sure that we recognize that everyone who makes vaccines a part of their regular health practice, we educate them properly on the technology behind the current vaccine, the safety behind the current vaccine, and how it may differ from areas where government did place themselves in a position of not being as trustworthy with communities of color and culture. That said, we also need to respect that there are groups that have not been involved in accepting vaccines. And so we have to not put ourselves at odds with those groups. There are cultural and faith groups that don't accept vaccines as part of their practice, but yet this is creating a scary situation for them, because when we're talking about things like vaccine cards, unless those vaccine cards have an exemption, a very clear exemption, the same way we have for the universal healthcare effort, you're looking at people who may not be able to have jobs or enjoy the city or enjoy the culture that they have within the city, the vibrancy of the city that they have a right to access. And so we have to be very clear that this process cannot be unilateral. It can be universal in the sense that for those who, again, I treat this from this and actually teach on it from a standard of health as a universal human right. We only create the framework for good health. So our job is to make sure that anyone who wants access to the vaccine, who wants to better understand about the vaccine, who wants to make sure that their children understand about why it's important for them to take the vaccine, because at 12, we're talking about body autonomy as well, that they have all those resources and supports, that there's active testing. Like I just took my son to Whittier Street just 2 weekends ago, right? And come to find out, the online access was hard, but when we walked in, it was smooth as the falling rain. It was not even a problem. We got in, he got his first dose, but it took him a while for me to walk through with him, make sure he understood. And I'm someone who has deep experience in public health. And it was still hard to get my 13-year-old to understand and make the decision for himself that this was a good decision for him. But we need to be able to make sure everyone has those supports. And for those whom it's not a health practice, make sure we have the right protections for them as well.
Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
That was Angie Camacho, candidate for Boston City Council in District 7.